In this video clip, we're going to talk more about acquisition and transmission of infectious agents. How do they move from one host to another? First, some terminology here that you need to know. Communicable versus non-communicable diseases. What's the difference? So that's some terminology you're going to hear from time to time. Not all infectious diseases are communicable. A communicable disease is one that can be spread from one host to another. There's some means of natural spread. A contagious infectious disease is one that is highly communicable. So sometimes you'll hear those two terms used interchangeably, but really they have. Contagious is a very easily spread type of infectious disease. A non-communicable disease is one that cannot be transmitted from human to human. Now there are lots of these. So if you have cancer, for example, that can't be spread from one person to another. That's going to be a non-communicable disease. Diabetes is a non-communicable disease. Multiple sclerosis is a non-communicable disease. So your microbial diseases are going to be the ones that are communicable or contagious. But you have to be careful about that. Not all infectious diseases that human patients develop are communicable. So if you have an infection by an opportunistic pathogen, that's been caused because some organism has seized an opportunity to get into a part of the body where it's not supposed to be. There may be no natural portal of exit for that opportunistic pathogen to get out, and then no means for it to naturally spread to another patient. So infections by opportunistic pathogens can at times be non-communicable. Sometimes microbes, through some sort of a procedure like surgery, will get into a part of the body, maybe a body compartment. Maybe they get into the abdominopelvic cavity and cause an infection there, but there's no way for them to get out. There's no exit from the body. There's no way for that organism to spread to another patient. So don't assume that all infectious diseases are communicable. There are cases where an infectious disease is only going to exist in that particular patient, and it's not going to be transmitted to another individual. Think about the Staphylococcus aureus food poisoning that we were discussing, where you have horrible vomiting and diarrhea because you swallowed an exotoxin in some food that you were eating. That's non-communicable. You're not going to spread that exotoxin out from your body to other individuals. All right, so how are the communicable and contagious infectious diseases transmitted? All right, transmission can be divided up into vertical and horizontal transmission. So we heard those terms before for genetics. Vertical and horizontal transfer of genetic information, and it's basically the same concept. Vertical transmission is from parent to offspring. So that can occur through the sperm, through an ovum, an egg cell, but more frequently it's in breast milk or across the placenta, like we've talked about before. So nursing infant, a mother to nursing infant, or in the womb, a microbe might cross the placenta into a developing embryo or fetus. So that's vertical. But what we're mainly focused on in this section of the chapter is on horizontal transmission. So this is spread from person to person within a population. And as we'll see, so horizontal transmission can be divided up into three major categories. We have direct or contact transmission. Then we have indirect transmission, of which there's more than one version of indirect transmission. In indirect transmission, the hosts don't actually have physical contact with each other. And then finally, there's vector transmission, and that involves arthropods, insects and other similar types of living things that can transmit pathogens. All right, so direct contact transmission, this category. So this is pretty obvious and straightforward. Touching, kissing, sexual contact. You're having actual physical contact with another individual who's sick, or that parenteral route of entry that we discussed earlier, where you pierce the skin or the mucous membrane, through a bite, through a bullet, through surgery, whatever. That's direct contact between the body and the microbe. And there is a special category, droplet transmission. So this occurs through sneezing or coughing. There are respiratory droplets that contain microorganisms, and you guys know this. But droplet transmission, those droplets are actually fairly large, so most of them are going to, by gravity, they're going to fall to the ground. So kind of the rule of thumb is, in order for transmission to truly be droplet transmission, you have to be within about a meter of the other individual, which is a little bit more than 3 feet. Now beyond there, the droplets will evaporate if they don't fall to the ground. And now some microbes will still remain airborne at that point. They might land on some dust particles and float around in the air. But in that case, if you pick them up later, that would be airborne transmission, which does not fall into this direct transmission category. So droplets are a special category, strictly from sneezing and coughing, and you've got to be really close, within 1 meter of the other person. All right, indirect transmission. So this is where you don't actually have physical contact with the other host from whom you're picking up this horrible pathogen. And there are different methods for this. One involves fomites. So that's a term you should be familiar with. And a fomite is simply an inanimate object that is harboring pathogens until a new host comes along and picks them up. So if you're sick and you drink out of a glass and another person comes along and drinks out of the same glass, you know your mama always taught you not to do that. The glass is a fomite. These nasty Kleenexes over here, if you handle those are fomites. They're inanimate objects where these pathogens are harbored. The surface of a table could be a fomite. And you'll hear that term used when you study about different infectious diseases, because some microbes can persist on fomites and some cannot. It just depends on the properties of that microorganism. You know, for example, HIV does not persist on fomites for any length of time. Thank goodness. Imagine if you could contract HIV by picking up some Kleenex that was used by a patient who was infected with it. All right, then we have vehicles, and then we have the special case of the oral fecal route that we'll talk about as well. All right, so what do we mean by vehicles? So vehicles of transmission, these are basically things where the microbes are going to be harbored or will allow them to travel from one host to another. So that's what we mean by vehicles in this case. And that's going to include water. We've already talked about water being a reservoir of infection, so we can also consider it to be a vehicle as well. These are going to be natural non-living materials, air. So again, droplets, respiratory droplets, if you're within 1 meter, that's considered a type of direct contact. But if you have smaller droplets or dust particles that contain microbes, those are also known as aerosols. So like we see this person sweeping. So let's say there were some, rodent droppings here on the ground, and as you're sweeping, it's aerosolizing these microorganisms that can make you sick, and then you breathe that in. That's a type of airborne transmission. Foods, of course, of various types can function as vehicles, and we all know that you can pick up pathogens from foods that you eat. Body fluids handled outside of the body. For example, if somebody's at the gym and they've got a Staphylococcus aureus infection on the skin, and they shed those bacteria in their sweat onto a piece of gym equipment, and then you come along and pick it up. So the body fluid in that case is functioning as a vehicle for transferring that microbe from one individual to another. You may be wondering what in the world this is. Pocari Sweat is an electrolyte replacement beverage, kind of like Gatorade, that is apparently sold in Japan, and that's the English name for it. I've had some past students who tell me they actually sell this at least one store in Huntsville, but I've never actually seen it myself. Great name, though, isn't it? Pocari Sweat. I'm sure that makes you just want to guzzle a gallon of it. The special case, the oral fecal transmission route, or fecal oral. A lot of people say fecal oral. And that can occur through fomites or vehicles, very common. So anything that gets shed in the feces, any kind of intestinal pathogen, many different types, get shed in the feces. It's gross to think about, but there's fecal contamination all over the environment. You know, people don't wash their hands necessarily all that thoroughly, and any type of fecal contamination out in the environment could be harboring intestinal pathogens. And you come along and you contact that fecal material, don't even realize it, fingers go into the mouth, or your fingers touch some food or, you know, a glass that you're going to drink out of, and you can pick up the pathogens that way. So that fecal oral or oral fecal route of transmission is a pretty common one. Now, how about vector transmission? So this is a special case. This is transmission by arthropods. So arthropods includes insects, mosquitoes, ticks, flies, lice, fleas, things like that, biting types of little miniature animals. And there are two categories here. You got biological vectors and you have mechanical vectors. A biological vector is an actual host for the pathogen. So the pathogen undergoes part of its life cycle, at least, inside the arthropod. And usually these are transmitted via biting. So this is like when a mosquito bites somebody who's infected with West Nile virus and sucks the West Nile virus up with their blood meal. The West Nile virus is actually multiplying inside it's replicating inside the mosquito. The mosquito is a host for it. And then in most cases, these pathogens get into the salivary glands of the biting arthropod, and the arthropod injects those into the new host when it bites a new host. But not always. Some of them deposit the microbes in their feces, and then you rub them into the body around an area where you've experienced a bite. And you may remember that. We talked a little bit about that when we went over Trypanosoma cruzi earlier in the semester, which causes Chagas's disease. The kissing bug is a vector that bites you and defecates, releases feces onto the surface of your skin or around the lips, and you rub, and that's what allows the little trypanosomes to enter the body. So if you ever wondered, like, you know, back when HIV first emerged, people were like, oh, you know, mosquitoes are going to transmit HIV, and you might wonder, well, why is that not the case? That doesn't happen because mosquitoes are not a host for HIV. So yes, mosquitoes may bite a person who's infected with HIV, suck up the blood, but the HIV is destroyed in the digestive tract of the mosquito. The mosquito is not a host. The HIV is not going to multiply and build up in numbers for transmission to a new host. Now, a mechanical vector, now you have to be careful with this name. This is not referring to any sort of piece of medical or mechanical equipment. This is a case where arthropods are a passive carrier, kind of like we talked about how you can have human passive carriers that carry microbes from one patient to another. A mechanical vector is an arthropod that's doing this. It's like over here, the cockroaches crawling all over your peanut butter and jelly sandwich. If those cockroaches had walked through some fecal contamination somewhere earlier, they might have picked up some pathogens, and now those pathogens got onto their legs or wings or whatever, and now they're depositing them on your peanut butter and jelly sandwich without you knowing about it. So in that case, it would be a mechanical vector. This is known to occur. Houseflies, cockroaches are notorious for this, and they're known for transmitting Salmonella, Escherichia coli. Some strains of that are nasty. Most E. coli is friendly, but there are nasty strains. And then Shigella is a relative of Escherichia coli that causes a nasty intestinal illness. Okay, so that's a review of the different types of transmission. So you want to be sure you learn that terminology, and because you'll when you're reading about different kinds of infectious disease, they'll almost always talk about how the pathogen is transmitted, because not all pathogens are transmitted in the same way. Not everything can be transmitted through an arthropod vector. Not all pathogens can persist on fomites. Not all pathogens will use water as a non-living reservoir. So you want to be sure you understand the terminology associated with transmission. All right, the next video lecture we're going to move on and talk about a really important topic for people going into healthcare, and this is HAIs, which stands for Healthcare Associated infections. This is a really crucial topic for you guys who are going to work with patients in any kind of capacity, and so that'll be the topic of the 12th lecture for Chapter 11.